Ever feel like you're trying to figure out a completely alien species just by, well, watching other people? One minute they're calm, the next, who knows what's going on?
Hmm.
But what if there are actually tools, ways to find patterns in all that apparent chaos? That's kind of where the human sciences come in.
Exactly.
So today we're doing a deep dive into their scope, what they try to do, where they bump up against limits, and maybe the big lessons we've learned trying to understand ourselves scientifically.
Yeah, and if you want to get a handle on this whole area quickly and, thoroughly, this is basically your shortcut.
We hope so.
We're not just winging it either. We've got this really interesting document, The Scope of the Human Sciences, and it kind of maps out the whole landscape, the ambitions, the practical realities of studying us systematically.
Eh?
Think economics, anthropology, psychology, how they all try to make sense of human behavior.
All right, let's unpack this then. What actually makes something a human science? It's got to be more than just thinking about people, right?
Precisely. Yeah, our source points to a few core things. First, the subject itself, it needs to be a systematic study. Individuals, groups, whole societies.
Systematic, meaning?
Meaning moving beyond just stories or anecdotes, looking for patterns, how groups behave in similar spots, like cultural anthropology, looking really closely at kinship systems on the Trobriand Islands.
Okay.
Or say, health economics, carefully measuring why people do or don't take up vaccines in rural India. It's structured investigation.
Right, so not just saying people are complicated, but actually digging into the how and why in a structured way.
Yeah.
What else is essential?
Second big thing, it has to be evidence-based. A commitment to findings that other people can check or, crucially, prove wrong, falsifiability.
Ah,
Okay.
so testing ideas against reality.
Exactly. Like political science exit polls, good ones publish their methods, their sampling frame, so anyone can look at it.
Right.
Or in psychology, there's this big push now for pre-registration on platforms like the Open Science Framework. Yeah, basically saying, okay, here's our hypothesis, here's exactly how we're going to test it before you collect the data. Helps avoid, fishing for results.
That makes a ton of sense. Keeps things honest.
Yeah.
So systematic study, checkable evidence. What's the third piece?
The third is about looking for the bigger picture, the intent to generalize, trying to find patterns that apply more broadly than just the specific people or situation you studied.
Okay, so moving from the specific to the general.
Like behavioral finance came up with prospect theory. It suggests people everywhere kind of show similar biases when making financial decisions, like hating losses more than they like equivalent gains.
Ah, prospect theory, right.
So it's about finding those maybe underlying currents in how humans act.
Interesting. So if we think about something like, say, literary studies, which definitely explores human experience really deeply, that wouldn't quite fit this definition, would it?
That's the distinction the source draws, yeah. Literary studies is more about interpreting meaning, exploring the nuances of a text or experience, not necessarily setting up hypotheses and testing them with data in the same way.
Right, different goals.
But, the lines can blur sometimes. Think about digital humanities people using computers to analyze huge amounts of text. They might run analyses looking for patterns, which starts to look a bit like an experiment.
Sure.
Still, the core of the human sciences, as laid out here, is that drive for systematic, evidence-based generalizations about us.
Okay, got it. So we understand the science part, but the source also talks about the different kinds of knowledge we get from human sciences compared to, say, literature. What's the core difference there?
Yeah, this is a really good point. Literature offers something the document calls situated insight.
Situated insight.
Yeah. Think about a novel like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun. You're plunged into the Biafran War, but through the eyes and feelings of individual characters. You feel the impact of history on a really personal human level. It's deep, empathetic understanding of a specific situation. Statistics alone can't really give you that.
Right, it's that visceral lived experience kind of knowing. So how does the human science approach contrast with that?
Human sciences usually aim for more. Abstraction. Political psychologists studying the same conflict, the Biafran War, might use surveys to measure in-group bias, maybe build a statistical model to see what factors predict reconciliation later on.
Okay, so stepping back to see broader trends.
Exactly. You get these generalizable patterns, potential causal links, maybe ideas about what might happen in other similar conflicts. You lose some of that intense personal detail, but you gain a different kind of understanding the bigger picture.
So it's like zooming out from the individual trees to see the shape of the forest.
Hmm.
And this difference matters for things like policymaking.
Absolutely. The document argues both kinds of knowledge are super valuable, especially for real-world problems.
Yeah.
Imagine designing something like a post-conflict truth commission. You'd want insights from novelists or historians about trauma, dignity, individual memory, that deep human understanding.
Right.
But you'd also want the social scientists' data on, say, which types of reconciliation processes seem to actually reduce future violence based on studies across different conflicts. It's about combining that deep insight with the broader evidence-based patterns.
Makes sense. Bring both the heart and the head to the problem.
Okay.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. You often hear people say that predictions in human science is just, well, they aren't very reliable, or they just doomed to be fuzzy.
Yeah. Yeah, the document tackles that perception head-on. It argues it's more accurate to say they're probabilistic, not necessarily wrong or useless.
Probabilistic, meaning based on odds.
Exactly. Take election forecasting. The source uses the 538 example for the 2016 U.S. election. They give Trump something like a 28% chance of winning.
I remember that. People were shocked he won.
Right, but 28% isn't zero. It means if you ran that election 100 times under those conditions, he might win about 28 of them. The outcome, while maybe surprising to some, was actually within the range of probability they calculated. It wasn't a failed prediction in a statistical sense.
Okay, so it's about understanding the likelihood, not expecting a crystal ball.
Hmm.
What about predicting something like a pandemic? That felt like, well, a bit all over the place early on.
Oh, for sure. And that's a great example of both the limits and the value. Early COVID models often didn't fully capture how much people's behavior would change over time. Lockdown fatigue, changing mask habits, that kind of thing.
Right, people react to the situation and to the predictions themselves.
Exactly. That's called reflexivity. The act of studying or predicting something can change the very thing you're studying. It makes forecasting human behavior way trickier than forecasting, say, planetary orbits.
So the models weren't perfect because humans are.
Human. Pretty much. But even those imperfect models were useful, right? Hospitals use the upper ranges of those predictions, the worst-case scenarios, to plan for ICU beds and ventilator needs. So they still offered value for planning, even if the exact numbers shifted.
Okay, so useful even with uncertainty. Are there areas where predictions are more reliable?
Definitely. The document mentions commodity demand forecasting. The Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, apparently developed a model predicting Indian wheat output for 2024 pretty accurately within about 3%.
Wow, that's quite precise. How?
The key seems to be integrating different kinds of data. They didn't just look at past harvests. They included agronomy data like rainfall patterns, soil conditions, and also policy information like potential export bans or subsidies.
So combining different factors.
Yeah. It suggests that when you have relatively stable underlying factors, when you can model the key feedback loops, and importantly, when you communicate the prediction as a range with probabilities, you can actually get quite reliable forecasts in the human sphere.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's not impossible, just challenging. Speaking of challenges, what are some of the big difficulties in just explaining human behavior scientifically, never mind predicting it?
Oh, there are quite a few hurdles the source highlights. First off, there's complex causation. Rarely is human behavior down to just one single thing.
Right.
Think about something like obesity. It's not just diet, right? It's this complex mix of genetics, gut microbiome, psychological factors like stress, learned eating habits, social stuff like food deserts, advertising.
Yeah, a whole web of influences.
Exactly. And trying to untangle which thread is doing what is incredibly hard.
Okay, so complex causes. What's another one?
Reflexivity, which we just talked about with predictions, is also a huge issue for explanation. The classic example is the Hawthorne effect.
Ah, the factory study.
Yeah, where researchers were studying lighting levels and worker productivity, but output seemed to go up regardless of the lighting changes, apparently just because the workers knew they were being observed.
Right. So the act of studying changed the behavior. Like trying to weigh something when the scale itself reacts to you being there.
Precisely. It makes it really tricky to isolate the actual cause of behavior.
What else gets in the way?
Measurement error and, well, dishonesty are big ones. How accurately can you measure someone's political beliefs in an authoritarian country using a survey?
People might be afraid to answer honestly.
Exactly. They might underreport support for the opposition, which skews your data. Then there are ethical limits. We obviously can't randomly assign people to live in poverty to study its effects directly.
Right, that would be horrific.
So researchers have to get creative. They look for natural experiments, situations where something happens in the real world, like a new factory opening in one town but not a similar one nearby, that sort of mimics a controlled experiment.
Clever, using naturally occurring variations. And I feel like I've heard about issues with studies not replicating.
Yes, that's another major challenge. The replication crisis, especially highlighted by a big 2015 project in psychology. They tried to reproduce the findings of 100 published studies,
Right.
and only about 40% of them produced statistically similar results. It was a real wake-up call.
Wow, it's concerning.
It was, and it led to important reforms. Things like that pre-registration we mentioned, more emphasis on sharing data, making methods transparent, basically trying to make the whole process more robust and reliable.
So it sounds like explaining human behavior scientifically is fraught with difficulties. But the document doesn't seem to suggest it's, like, impossible.
No, not at all. The key takeaway isn't give up. It's more like be aware. These difficulties mean we need to use diverse methods, qualitative and quantitative, be really transparent about how we did the research, and be honest about the fact that findings are often tentative. Science is a process of revision, right? Especially here.
Okay, that makes sense. Humility is key. Now, even if individuals seem unpredictable, the document raises a really interesting point about aggregate behavior.
Yeah.
Do patterns emerge when we look at large groups?
Yes, this is crucial. While any one person might do something totally unexpected, when you zoom out and look at thousands or millions of people, surprisingly stable patterns often appear. It's the law of large numbers kicking in.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The source mentions a study that analyzed billions, literally billions of tweets. They found links between the overall mood or happiness expressed in tweets at the state level in the US and other big societal indicators like obesity rates, income levels, even education.
Whoa. So the collective sentiment online actually reflects real-world societal factors.
Apparently so. It's not about predicting your next tweet, but about seeing these large-scale correlations.
That's pretty amazing. What are some other examples where group behavior becomes predictable?
Think about insurance companies. Actuaries can't possibly predict if you specifically will crash your car next year.
Hopefully not.
Right. But they can build incredibly accurate models predicting the overall percentage of claims, the loss ratios, across millions of drivers. That allows the whole insurance system to function.
Ah, okay. Predictability in the mass.
Or another example, urban planning. Think about apps like Strava, where people track their bike rides or run.
Yeah, the heat maps.
Exactly. Those heat maps show aggregate patterns where lots of people tend to cycle. City planners can look at that data and say, okay, this corridor clearly needs a better bike lane based on revealed collective preference. So individual choices might seem random, but robust patterns emerge at the macro level.
That's a really powerful idea. Individual unpredictability doesn't stop us from seeing and using group patterns. Okay, let's talk about how we organize all this study. We've got psychology, sociology, economics, anthropology, all these different fields.
Yeah.
Do these boundaries help or hinder understanding?
The disciplinary boundaries question. The source suggests it's, well, a double-edged sword. On the one hand, specialization is powerful. It allows researchers to develop deep expertise in very specific tools and methods. Think about air pollution's impact.
Okay.
You need chemists to precisely measure the pollutants. Then you need epidemiologists to link those exposure levels to specific health outcomes like asthma rates. Then maybe economists calculate the cost of lost workdays due to that asthma. Each discipline brings its specialized lens, offering a deep, if partial view.
Right, you get really detailed knowledge within each box. But what's the downside of staying in those boxes?
The downside, the hindrance, is that sometimes these disciplinary silos prevent us from seeing the whole picture or tackling complex problems effectively. The document uses the opioid crisis in the US as a stark example.
How did silos affect that?
Well, for a long time, you had medical researchers primarily focused on pain management protocols and the pharmacology of opioids. Separately, you had sociologists and economists pointing to broader social determinants like poverty, unemployment, and community breakdown in affected areas.
And they weren't talking to each other enough.
Often not effectively, no. The different pieces of the puzzle weren't being put together quickly enough. It arguably wasn't until the overdose death rates became undeniable that truly interdisciplinary efforts ramped up to address the medical, social, and economic aspects simultaneously.
So the boundaries slow down a comprehensive response. It sounds like we need people who can kind of speak multiple disciplinary languages.
Yeah.
The source mentioned trilingual scholars.
Exactly, that's the term used. As these hybrid fields emerge, think neuroeconomics, connecting brain activity to economic decisions, or environmental psychology, there's a growing need for researchers who are comfortable with the methods, theories, and, yes, even the jargon of multiple disciplines.
People who can bridge the gaps.
Precisely. These trilingual scholars can act as translators and connectors, helping different fields work together more effectively on those really knotty, complex human problems.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, one of the really big questions the document touches on. Can we find laws of human behavior, like laws of physics, but for people?
Yeah, that's a classic ambition, isn't it? The document's take is nuanced. It suggests that while we probably won't find immutable universal laws, like, say, gravity, we do observe regularities and patterns that are surprisingly robust. They might be statistical, context-dependent, but still quite durable.
Okay, so not laws like EMI sub, but strong tendencies. What are some examples?
Well, the law of supply and demand in economics is a good candidate. The source gives this example. When onion prices doubled in India in 2023, the amount people bought dropped in a way that was pretty consistent with elasticity estimates from studies done in the US.
Interesting. So a similar reaction across different cultures.
Yeah, suggesting a general human tendency. But,
Yeah.
and this is key, context matters. Government subsidies, rationing, cultural importance of onions, all that can modify the effect in a specific place, so it's not absolute.
Got it. Strong tendency, but sensitive to context. What else looks like a potential law?
There's the Weber-Fechner law from psychophysics. It basically describes how our perception of something like loudness or brightness increases logarithmically, not linearly, with the actual physical intensity. And this seems to hold up pretty well across different languages, different age groups, though, again, maybe not at the absolute extremes of sensation.
And you mentioned prospect theory earlier.
Yes, it's value function, that idea that losses loom larger than equivalent gains, loss aversion. This has been observed in lab experiments and even real-world betting markets in something like 80 countries. It seems pretty widespread.
But maybe not universal.
Potentially not. The source notes that even this might be reversed in certain contexts, like maybe among highly experienced financial traders who've been trained to think differently about losses.
So these human science laws seem much more flexible, maybe more influenced by culture or learning than laws in the natural sciences.
Exactly. I think most researchers in these fields view them more as powerful heuristics, really useful rules of thumb, high probability patterns, rather than absolute, unchanging truths carved in stone. They can evolve as societies and behaviors evolve.
Right. Okay, one last crucial area that the document raises, the real-world pressures. How do things like funding and politics influence what research gets done and what gets published?
This is super important, yeah. It's naive to think science happens in a vacuum. The source gives a pretty damning historical example, the Sugar Research Foundation, back in the 1960s.
What do they do?
They paid Harvard scientists to publish research that downplayed the link between sugar consumption and heart disease, shifting the blame more towards fat.
Wow. Seriously.
Seriously. And that had huge, long-lasting impacts on dietary guidelines and public health. It shows how financial interests can directly shape the research agenda and the findings that get promoted.
That's pretty sobering. Does that still happen?
Well, things are better in some ways. Most reputable journals now require researchers to disclose their funding sources, which adds transparency. But the underlying pressures haven't vanished.
Where do we see that now?
Think about research funded by industries related to fossil fuels on climate change, or debates around AI ethics funded by major tech companies. It doesn't automatically mean the research is bad, but it highlights the crucial importance of knowing who paid for the study and being critical about potential biases in the questions asked or the interpretation of results.
Right. Follow the money, as they say. Okay, so bringing this all together, after this deep dive into the scope of human sciences, what are the main takeaways for us?
Well, I think the big picture is that the human sciences are this ambitious, ongoing project. They try to systematically study us, find patterns, explanations, maybe even those probabilistic laws. But they also have to grapple with immense complexity, with that reflexivity problem, with measurement challenges, ethical limits.
And the label human science comes from that commitment.
Yeah, the commitment to systematic, evidence-based inquiry. The source stresses that predictions get better when they model feedback and state uncertainties clearly. Explanations get richer with mixed methods. And insights really flourish when those disciplinary walls aren't too high.
So understanding all this isn't just for academics. It gives you, the listener, a really valuable lens for looking at the world, for making sense of news reports, policy debates, maybe even your own behavior.
Absolutely. It helps you ask better questions about the information you encounter. And maybe that leads us to a final thought for you to ponder.
Yeah.
Given all this complexity, the messiness of human behavior, the ethical constraints, the fact that we change because we study ourselves, how can we best use the insights we do gain from the human sciences? How can we use them wisely, ethically, to build better policies, better communities, maybe even lead slightly better lives ourselves?
That's a great question to leave folks with. How do we use this powerful but imperfect toolkit well? Lots to think about there.